Awesome. Thank you. All right, everybody, welcome to our third of 5 new charter applicant trainings. Today, we are going to talk about the operations and addendum section of the application. The structure and format will be very similar to our previous application trainings. And so there'll be opportunities to ask questions kind of built in as we go. But if you should have questions as they come up, feel free to raise your hand or just take yourself off mute and ask. So today we'll go over some of the same information we go over each training about our application and these trainings. We'll talk about the operations section first. As a reminder, every applicant does need to complete the operations section. We'll then talk at a high level about the addendum. The addendum is only required for CMO applicants and schools that intend to contract with an EMO or a CMO. And then we'll talk about final reminders and next steps. As a reminder of who we are, we have Melissa McAdin on this call. She's the executive director of the SPCSA. My name is Katie Broughton. I serve as the director of authorizing. And then we also have Danny joining us. He's a management analyst 3, but he really leads a lot of the application work and will be your main point of contact up until the submission of the application. Tonight is our third of 5 trainings. We have the operations plan and addendum that we're tackling tonight. We will go over the financial plan and the updated financial plan workbook on February 6th. And then our 5th and final training will be on the clarifying questions and capacity interview. This year, that's the first time we've done a training that captured those 2 pieces of the application process. As a reminder, there are 3 parts to the application materials: the guidance document, which is basically the application and rubric put together side by side, sort of the keystone of this work. The application template is the Word template that includes all of the questions that need to be answered by the applicant. We have it downloadable as a Word file, so you can just fill it in. Please don't delete things. And then we also have our rubric, which describes the characteristics of a strong response that would meet standards for each section of the application. As a reminder of the application timeline, things really start to kick off January 30th. This is our last training before that January 30th deadline, which is when the notice of intent is due. The link for that can be found on the Open to Schools page of our website. As a reminder, if you plan to submit an application in April, you must submit a notice of intent. But if you submit a notice of intent and then decide you're not ready to submit an application, that is completely acceptable. But it is a requirement if you're submitting an application in April. So if there's even a 1% chance you're going to submit that application in April, make sure you complete that notice of intent. And then SPCSA staff will follow up with you after that notice of intent deadline. Again, our application guidance document is divided into 2 parts. In the first part is the introduction, some glossary of terms, resources for applicants, and then an overview of the process. And then part 2 takes the application questions and the rubric criteria, puts them side by side, and offers some guidance regarding each subsection and things to consider and resources to go to. As we've talked about before, there are 2 applicant types: a committee to form. There are statutory requirements regarding membership of a committee to form, and then a charter management organization that's going to apply directly to the State Public Charter School Authority and then transfer the charter contract over to a governing board. If you're not sure which one of these you meet or you're unclear, please reach out to us and we can help clarify. Primarily, you'll probably all be from committee to forms. Charter management organizations as applicants are a bit more rare. So we're going to start today with the operations section, and I'm going to hand it over to Danny to take over and kick us off with these first few sections of the operations section.
All right. Thank you, Katie. As you can see there, Danny Peltier, many of you I've talked with before, and happy to see you all here this evening. As you can see in the highlighted red, we're going to be talking about the operations plan. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's an overview of the required subsections of the operations plan. So you're going to see the board governance section. This is going to be verifying membership requirements are met, confirm policies and procedures are drafted, and to understand the proposed board capacity and familiarity with the proposal. There's a leadership team section. This is going to be talking about the to understand the leadership team, the roles and responsibilities, and how individuals will effectively manage the proposed school. The staffing plan. That's going to be to understand the overall staffing plan for the proposed school, both in year 1, year 2, year 3, and that'll all kind of be built out as part of the charter application. And then the human resources, which is to understand the recruitment, hiring, evaluation plans, and processes for the proposed school. Next slide. Other sections that are required as part of the operations, the student recruitment and enrollment. This is going to determine if sufficient evidence of demand exists for the proposed model and to evaluate those plans to effectively recruit and enroll students. The incubation year is basically the year before the school is operational. And this section is going to be asking questions that will confirm key milestones are in place during year 0, ensuring that all required activities and expenses are accounted for in the budget, and to ensure there is sufficient capacity to execute those plans. The services section, that's kind of a broad section that encompasses essential and program specific non-academic services such as transportation, food services, facility management, purchasing, basically all the items that you will need to kind of have the school up and running as an entity. And then there's the facilities piece, which is going to go into the application understanding of evaluating the facility plans, both short and long term, and including the viability of the cost of the proposed facility or plans to identify a facility in the event that that facility has not yet been identified.
And Danny,
Yep.
before you get into the content here, just as a reminder, with this application, there's the narrative section. And again, that's what you download from our website and you answer all the questions in the narrative section. And then there's additional attachments that go along with various sections of the rubric. And just throughout this slide, as well as the last slide deck, I have highlighted the attachments and sort of which question they relate to, as well as which section they should align with. So this is just visual so that you all understand sort of which attachment is relevant to which subsection. Sorry, Danny.
No, thank you. That's really helpful because the attachments is part of our completeness check. That's one of the first places that we go to make sure that all the attachments are there. So when you see something is required to be submitted as an attachment as part of your final piece, make sure all those attachments are there. So let's dive into some of the subsections here. We're going to begin with the board governance section. So as you can see on the left side there, we have listed some of the board governance questions that are part of the application. And then on the right side of the screen, you see examples from our rubric and the criteria that us as a review team are going to be using in order to review the application. We've really tried to take a very intentional approach with our rubric in comparison with the application so that you all as applicants have a very clear understanding what we are looking for, and not only that what we are looking for, but that the rubric kind of aligns with the questions as they go through so that it's very easy for you all to kind of take a look and see like, okay, describe the primary roles of the governing board. And then you see over the criteria at the top there, the proposed governance structure, include delineations of the roles and responsibilities, blah, 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 blah. You can read all that. But we're really trying to make it clear for you all the question that we're asking and then how that aligns with the criteria so that you have a very clear understanding what the review team is going to be looking at as part of the overall review process. Next slide. Again, you can see here some additional board governance questions, and you can see the rubric on the right. Basically, kind of what I said before, really trying to align these questions with the rubric that we have. I'm not going to go into, all the different questions we have there. We're recording we're recording this training today, and that, you can take a look at the slides as well, but just really highlighting that rubric is really aligned with what the application is, and I would highly encourage folks to really have both of those up as they're filling out the application. Next slide. So something that we're doing a little bit differently over the past few years, and we're really trying to emphasize this year, is we are adding criteria for the review of the application that goes beyond just the written piece of the application. We're adding in criteria that we're using as part of the rubric for the capacity interview. And so, as you can see there, while most of the criteria is evaluated both in the written application and the capacity interview, we are highlighting areas with an asterisk in the rubric that will only be evaluated as part of the capacity interview. And you can see there on the right side, the proposed governing board members demonstrate a deep understanding of the educational model, organization's mission, and what that mission achievement looks like. There's an ownership and commitment that the proposed governing board shows throughout the capacity interview. The proposed governing board demonstrates the ability to work together to solve problems. That little item there, that's really going to be gauged as part of the scenario-based question, which each applicant has as part of their capacity interview. And so we kind of do a fishbowl exercise. We're going to get into that a little bit further down the line, but that's where you're going to see the ability, where we gauge an ability that the governing board is working together in this kind of fishbowl exercise as part of the capacity interview. The proposed governing board members demonstrate that they understand the role of the board. And then for schools contracting with an EMO or a CMO, the governing board demonstrates the understanding of their role in overseeing and holding both the EMO or the CMO accountable for delivering results. So a couple of things with that. If you as a committee to form propose contracting with an EMO or a CMO, it is you, the proposed board, that's going to hold the contract between the State Public Charter School Authority Board and yours. And so we expect that the proposed board, as part of the capacity interview, understands what their role is in holding that entity accountable for results that are included as part of their contract. And if those results are not what the board is expecting, that they are able to have those entities before their board and to discuss and to make changes and really, hold their feet to the fire in the event that the proposed entity in which the CM or the governing board is contracting with for educational or charter management is holding up their end of the bargain. Next slide. So some hallmarks of successful applicants with regard to the board governance. Proposed board demonstrates the necessary capacity to effectively govern the proposed charter school. And that goes beyond just being there. That goes into really, as a board member, having a clear idea of what the school's mission, the model, what the outcomes that are expected that are going to be part of the narrative of the application, that those core principles are being implemented once the school is open and operational. Reporting structures in the application are well defined. The board has the strong oversight to evaluate service providers. The application should account for governance training. Governance training is another area in which the SPCSA is taking a closer and more emphasized look on. We expect our boards to comply with open meeting law and all the various aspects of good governance. And so we expect that as part of the application narrative, and the board members, proposed board members, as part of the capacity interview, should be able to give that information as well. And then we're looking for draft policies, code of ethics, bylaws, the such. We're looking for those as part of a successful application. Some red flags that we do see during the application process the applicant doesn't meet the minimum statutory requirements for a board and does not provide a reasonable and timely plan to do so. So you'll note that in the application, you're going to be required to identify certain folks who are attached to certain requirements that are based in NRS. If you don't have the full group, there is areas in which that you can fill those gaps throughout the application process and possibly post approval. But if that is not clear as part of the application process, that's a very big red flag that the application team has not considered, contemplated, and planned for filling gaps in the team that were there as part of the application submission. The proposed board is overly reliant on service providers or individuals not on the governing board during the capacity interview. So you have your committee to form. A lot of times, many of the committee to form members are going to be proposed board members. Additionally, there may be areas where the proposed board is contracting with a CMO or an EMO. If we go into a capacity interview and it appears that the vast majority of the proposed people that are going to serve on the board may not have a very clear understanding of what the school is, what the school's model is looking like, the community in which they're proposing to serve, that's a big red flag. So we expect that folks who are tied to this application as part of the process are going to have a very clear understanding of what that model looks like, the work that's being done on the ground to kind of engage with the community, and that those proposed board members have been out there doing that work. And then finally, the board is unable to speak to community engagement. That kind of goes back to what I'm talking about. We don't expect we expect applications that when they're submitted to us, we understand that the school is not in existence yet, but the work throughout the application process should already have been going on. And we expect to see examples and evidence that the proposed school's board, the committee to form, are out in the community engaging folks with the idea of the school and really getting the feedback from the community on what this school is going to look like, maybe taking into account concerns the community has and maybe implementing those as part of the charter application. So we expect to see that as part of the charter application. Next slide. Okay, leadership team. So the SPCSA does not require a leader to be identified as part of the application. And you will see as part of our rubric criteria on the right and then questions on the left, you're going to see items where if a school leader has been selected, here's some answers. If a school leader has not been selected, here's some answers. We do not take a this is good or this is not as good. We totally understandable if the committee to form has yet to identify a school leader, or if they have, that's great. But there is various different parts of the application there within the leadership team that you will fill out based upon where you're at as a committee to form when the application is submitted. So if the leader, you can see here, there's various attachments that are part of the leadership team. One of the first attachments is attachment 11 there, the organizational charts for year one and for when the school is at full capacity. That's kind of what we've seen in the past is sometimes the org charts are kind of just year one and then it's kind of built out to year 6, but the org chart doesn't really match kind of the narrative within the application. Attachment 11 should be very clear as to what the school looks like in that year one and how it grows and how the different pieces grow out. And that aligns with the rest of the application. So, while it's just an org chart and a lot of people say, oh, we'll just put it into Word, you really want to make sure to have a clear understanding of what the school is going to be looking like from a leadership capacity throughout the initial charter term. You can see there, number 3, attachment 12, that the school leader has been selected. We do require that the application, that the leader's resume is submitted as part of the application. We expect to see a leader who is both qualified and has a strong understanding of the proposed school's model. If the leader has not yet been identified, what we expect to see is a very clear and robust process, timeline, and selection criteria for whoever it is that the committee to form intends to hire as a school leader. Attachment 13, the leadership team, it's a team. It's not just a single person. And to run a school, there's going to be multiple leaders. We expect to see the full build out of what that leadership team is going to look like, the positions that are going to be filled, what the qualifications are for those folks are going to be, and how all of those people are going to work together to progress the school's mission towards where the application academic plan, all the other aspects of the application intend to have it be. And then finally, for the attachment 14 there, evaluation tools. A lot of times what we see is that charter schools will use evaluation tools that are, through the Department of Ed. That's fine, but we do expect that we don't want to see a copy and paste. If you want to use the criteria that the Department of Ed uses or some other entity, that's fine. But really weave that through the leadership team section and how the proposed board is truly going to hold that leader accountable using those evaluation tools. And you can see over there on the criteria, a lot of the items that I was talking about before are measured throughout the entire leadership team rubric criteria. Okay, so the capacity interview, like the board governance, there are areas with the capacity interview that we will be evaluating solely based on the interview and not so much as part of the written narrative. This really is going to go for folks who have identified a school leader. If a school leader has been identified, that they should be demonstrating that deep knowledge of the proposed academic model and the understanding of how the school's mission supports the school students and families. We're going to be looking for a leader that demonstrates the ability to work together to solve problems, both in the capacity interview, meaning the leader understanding that the board is ultimately evaluating them. A school leader still needs to be able to kind of manage up, work with the board, but also be able to manage down. And how is that kind of discussed as part of the overall application narrative that's written, that's submitted come April 30th? And then you can see there that the leader, the responsibilities they have in the community, engagement, and just understanding the proposed student population. This leader, if that person has been identified and is included as part of the application submission, that person really should be, boots on the ground as part of the application and should be out there prior to the submission and really working with the proposed folks that the school is going to be enrolling. Don't want to dig too much into it, but hallmarks of some successful applicants, a lot of what I've talked about before: school leaders identified, relevant experience, presents clear plans to develop a school leader if they haven't been maybe identified, or there's a school leader that needs additional training. It's clear and well defined evaluation tools, the criteria that the board's going to use to evaluate the successes or failures of that school leader, and that the board, that's going back to the governance section, understands that role that they're going to be holding when evaluating that school leader. And then obviously some red flags, concerns. The application does not include the school leader and this is really key, and does not include a detailed process, job description, timeline. Like I said before, we're not expecting everyone to have a school leader identified. If you don't, we're totally fine with that. But if there's not a clear understanding of from our side of what you're looking for and the process and the timeline that you're going to complete that in, that's where the red flag comes in. The proposed leadership structure does not align with the narrative. There's inconsistencies with regard to what the academic plan is talking about and maybe what the leadership team looks like. And then the identified school leader does not have sufficient experience with the proposed model or the anticipated student population. Staffing plan. You all can see what's on the screen here, but one of the main things I want to highlight for the staffing plan that we see that is a very, very common occurrence across the applications, is that the staffing plan is not aligned with what is included as part of the academic narrative. And then it's also not aligned with what is included as part of the budget. The academic plan talks about having all these different counselors and all this different one-to-one things. Then you get to the staffing plan in the operations section, and maybe the chart is not quite aligned. And then you go to the budget, and there's no positions or FTEs listed at all. And so one of the main things I can talk about with the staffing plan is that as you work through the application, you want to really make sure that what you're talking about in the academic plan and the staffing that you're proposing as part of the staffing plan in the operations sections, those two things align, and that at the end, the budget makes sense for all of that. And we see more often than not, the staffing plan has inconsistencies. We get it. There's a lot of academic folks who are working on the academic plan. Then you have some operations people that are kind of working through what it's going to look like operationally. And then you got your finance people that are kind of doing the application piece. I really encourage you all, make sure that prior to the application submission, if we identify X amount of counselors as part of, special ed or one of the other sections, that needs to be reflected as part of the staffing plan and in the budget. Next slide. You can see here the staffing plan chart. This is not a place just to kind of add numbers willy-nilly through year 6. We really are taking a close look at what you're proposing both in year 1 and how that grows out through year 6. If you say that you're going to have additional leadership positions in year 3 as part of the academic narrative, we expect to see that reflected in the academic or in the staffing plan here and in the financial plan. Same goes for social workers, all that stuff. If you're saying year 2, we expect to see it here in year 2, and we expect to see it in the budget in year 2. So really go and align those, because the alignment piece is where we see a lot of issues. And if it's not aligned across the application, then we have to consider, did the full team get together and talk about what this plan was, or it was just individual groups kind of compiling an application and then submitting it? Next slide.
And I'll just add one thing. This table is included as something that needs to be completed, but you can feel free to make revisions as necessary. So if the head of your school is not going to be referred to as the principal, but they're going to be called the executive director, feel free to change principal to executive director. What also happens is different titles are used in different places. So there'll be a principal included in the staffing plan, but then the budget contemplates an executive director, and we're not sure if that's the same person or is there going to be 2 or whatever. So make this this is, typical suggestions and typical things that we see, but feel free to edit this as it fits your school. And again, just going back to what Danny said, make sure it matches the staffing plan in the budget, including the names of the titles, as well as the staffing plan that is needed to support the academic plan proposed in section 2.
And if you change principal on this to executive director, but then throughout the narrative and other pieces, you're calling that person a principal, that's kind of goes back to the alignment too. So if you're calling someone an executive director in the academic plan, it should be called the executive director. And I mean, you'd be surprised to see how many times there's a lot of questions about, like, this person was identified as X in this section, but it appears that this person is identified as Y in this section. Are they the same person? And so you really want to kind of get out ahead of those prior to the submission so that the review team isn't confused about what you're proposing based upon the terminology that is used throughout the charter application. Finally, we kind of talked a lot about it, but staffing plan, it needs to be appropriately scaled. If you have X amount of students, we expect to see X amount of staff. The budget, can't say it enough. Make sure that the budget is accounting for all the staffing needs that are talked about in the academic plan and in the operations plan. The inconsistencies between the narrative, the staffing chart, and the budget, if there's we're going to have a problem. And then the staffing plan does not provide sufficient evidence that the proposal has enough capacity to effectively serve the anticipated student population. So if you're proposing to serve X amount of EL students, and then there's not an EL teacher, that's a problem that's going to be identified as part of the staffing plan. So it's not just about aligning numbers, it's about aligning people who have the licenses, the expertise with students in areas that are part of the academic plan. We expect to see that as part of the staffing plan in the operations section. Human resources, really what we're looking for is both with the kind of alignment with the staffing plan, that there's clear understanding from the applicant team regarding the performance metrics that are going to be used for the staff, the criteria for hiring, the criteria for dismissal, that there's the proper the human resources functions that are going to be as, supporting the school. If a school is proposing to sign with a back office provider, that the details are there with regard to what that back office provider is going to be providing, and that the proposed board understands what that looks like from their perspective, as far as, making sure the back office provider is doing what they need to do. This is a smaller section, but, these are the human resources aspect of the application. These are the teachers that the school is going to be hiring, and we expect to see that the proposed committee to form, and if a leader is identified, or an EMO or a CMO or a back office provider, that they have the understanding of all the aspects of what's going to be needed for their staff, so that it's very clear that that people are going to be working at the school are going to be taken care of, and both held accountable, but also background checked. Payroll is going to be on time. Who's doing PERS? All those different things need to be included as part of the human resources section. Staff recruitment strategies are reasonable. Teacher shortage is a thing in Nevada. It's a thing nationwide. It's very difficult to find teachers, and so there needs to be clear recruitment strategies, understanding that it's going to be tough, but you need to really think through that and include that as part of the human resources section. Human resources function, payroll, benefits, background checks, they're appropriately accounted for within the application. You'd be surprised how many times we see schools that just have those are little things that kind of, when you're getting the school up and going, that kind of maybe fall by the wayside. So really think through those as part of the written application, so that you can kind of fall back on them and implement them if approved. And then obviously some red flags. Evaluation systems are detailed. They don't align to other parts of the narrative. You identify somebody that's going to be doing back office support in the operations section, but then maybe the budget doesn't incorporate those costs. Alignment is really key. And so that's the one thing I will continue to emphasize across all of our trainings, is that this is a very large document, and that all these different components need to align with one another so that it all makes sense to the review team. I am happy to take questions before I turn it back over to my colleague, Katie. We have a lot of people here. If you want to put things in the chat, or feel free to come off of your mute button and ask a question. We're more than happy to take those if you do have questions.
Danny, I was wondering about the proportion of applications without a school leader. And I mean, would you say that's at 2/3 now, but that they do have good job descriptions in there, things like that?
I don't know if I have a proportion per se. I would say it's, almost split. Like, I would say each cycle may differ, but like I said before, if the school leader has been identified, that person needs to really have an intimate knowledge of what the proposal is. And if that person has not been identified, then we expect to see a very clear description of what the process is going to be look like for identifying that person. I can't speak to whether, it's 50-50 or not, but overall, I think we've seen success both with schools who have hired proposed leaders after and who've had proposed leaders on the front end.
Thank you. Just one more question. I've wondered if any school leaders, excuse me, have ever expressed that they're reluctant to put their name as the proposed principal because they're currently working as a principal or something like that at another, like a district school, and they don't want to take a risk of something happening to them, of it impacting their current employment, especially if the application never gets approved.
Yeah, I mean, Katie, if you'd want to add anything, or Melissa, but overall, I've not seen, concern if you're a proposed school leader and you're interested in signing up to be part of a committee to form. We're pretty clear as part of our application process that these are, while we redact email, phone numbers, these are public documents, and you're going to be required to be both part of the capacity interview, most likely part of a board meeting. So if you're interested in signing up for a school to be a proposed school leader, then that's kind of, that kind of comes along with the bargain there as far as being part of the committee to form. So, I haven't seen anybody explicitly have a problem with it, but that's not to say that I haven't heard of something that may have come up in another time.
Oh, thank you.
Any other questions before we move along to other aspects of the operations section? Okay, Katie, I am going to turn it back over to you.
All right, so the next subsection is student recruitment and enrollment. And, this section is pretty deep within the application, but I think it's one of the most critical pieces of the application process and the pre-opening year and actually getting the school started. Student recruitment marketing and confirmed enrollment is probably the single biggest challenge that schools face after approval. And it is really, really important to not only think through what your strategies are going to be, how you're going to differentiate yourself from other charter schools who are kind of, on the market, but also that you're providing realistic enrollment targets. And I think when possible, be as conservative as you can. We are seeing schools just really, really struggle with enrollment in that first year, and it takes years to catch up from those struggles. So you want to be as conservative as you can with those enrollment projections and really, really make sure you're proactively thinking about how you're going to ensure that you're able to capture your students being enrolled. Another trend that we see is that while a lot of times, people can host various evenings and events and parents will express interest, it's a very low percentage of that interest that actually converts into full enrollment. So just as much as possible, be as conservative with these projections as you can be. Dolly, go ahead.
So with regard to that, I guess I'm not sure the right way to ask this, but I guess how close does what's in our final application have to align with our notice of intent that we're filing next week? So for example, the school that I'm working with, they're already in existence, but they're partnering with another school and utilizing the educational charter of that other school. And now they're at a point where they're ready to branch out on their own. So, so we already have an existing, school population and an existing growth plan, but, but we're still putting together, all of the budget and operations information. And so we're kind of struggling with, exactly where we should be starting as far as the notice of intent, knowing that number could be different from, where we land when we finally have all the other pieces together.
And that, Dolly, is totally fine. If your notice of intent is more of a hypothesis estimation, that's completely fine. And then, what you present in April is your final proposed enrollment numbers. But I would just, again, really caution, what you present in April and what you put in your application does ultimately go into your charter contract. So that's the number that like you are going to kind of be married to, at least for your first 2 to 3 years, depending on academic performance. So it's 100% fine to do kind of a hypothesis for your notice of intent and then make changes as you develop your budget. But you really want to make sure that you're at a really solid place that you feel really good about by the April application. Does that answer your question?
So when you say married to the number, do you mean married to that as a minimum?
So I'll talk about that in the next slide,
Okay,
if that
perfect.
works, because I've got it kind of laid out. But
Yep.
yeah, I will talk about the enrollment number there.
Okay.
So like I said, it's really, really important to think about kind of how you're going to market your school. What is the enrollment process going to look like? How are you going to track, students enrolling and collecting the documents that you're going to need? Who are you going to potentially contract with for marketing? Who are going to be some of your community partners? We really want to see evidence of demand, and that's attachment 16, and that's a document that we provide for you. But we really want to see evidence of demand, and just the more of it there is, the better, because then the more likely those are to convert over to students who will enroll in the school.
Katie, can I add one quick thing on the evidence of demand? Many times we see Excel documents that it's unclear as to who filled out what. When we're looking for evidence of demand, we're really looking for notices of intent to enroll. And it's not just people who are interested in charter schools. We also are looking for notices of intent to enroll of children who are of age that the school, when the school opens. So it's not just kind of going out and gathering support for the idea of charter schools. What we're really looking for is evidence that those people who are included as part of this charter application have an intent to enroll in that charter school. And so really keep that in mind as you're working through. We want to see all the different evidence you have, but really keep that in mind that we expect to see, more than just an Excel sheet that lists a bunch of names, and more than just kind of tons of families really like the idea of charter schools, and you're proposing a high school, and the vast majority of them were first graders. So keep that in mind as you're doing those community-based events.
So I'll talk a little bit about question 4, which is specific to the enrollment tables, and it asks for essentially 3 ways to break down your enrollment. The first is a break-even budget scenario, which is basically the minimum enrollment required for the school to be financially viable. So how many students must you have enrolled in order for you to make your financial plan work? And again, that is hopefully a lower number than your planned enrollment, but it's really important for you, for your board, for us to know we have to have 127 students enrolled on day 1 in order for this school to be financially viable and essentially break even. So if we have 127 students on day 1, we will, like, our expenditures will match our revenue, and that's that break even scenario. Planned enrollment is what ultimately we will base your enrollment cap on. So your planned enrollment is how many students you're aiming to enroll and in what grade levels. Well, they're all that, but planned enrollment is like, you want to start with a K through 4 school, and you want to have 2 sections of 25 kids, which is 5 times 50, 250 kids. So you would put your enrollment at 250 kids for year 1. Maybe the following year you want to add 2 more sections of 5th grade. So then you move it up to 300 students. So it's sort of like the planned enrollment that makes your organizational plan, your staffing plan, your academic plan sort of all fit together and come together perfectly. Now, this number will be incorporated into the charter contract, which means it requires an amendment to change. There's two amendments that go with the enrollment cap. One is a reduction of the enrollment cap, and then one is an increase of the enrollment cap. If a school has 100 students as their planned enrollment, they are required to enroll between 90 to 110% of that enrollment. So you can have, if your enrollment cap is 100, you can have 90 to 110 students and you're in alignment with your enrollment cap. If you have fewer than 90 students, we require a reduction in enrollment amendment. And basically, you know, it goes to your board. You say to us, we didn't meet our enrollment targets. We do require a budget that goes along with it. And that goes before our board. So we change the enrollment cap. We lower it down so that it matches your actual enrollment. Going beyond what's in your in the planned enrollment in your charter contract, going more than 110% requires an additional, like an expansion is what we call it, because you're trying to serve more students. That has to be done before you have those students enrolled. So again, like if your enrollment cap is 100, you can go between 90 to 110. If you plan to enroll, you know, 150, you have to have an amendment before you can enroll those extra students, and that amendment has to be approved by the SPCSA board. Our SPCSA board does not expand enrollment in grade levels, ages, any of those things without demonstrated academic performance. And so you have to have 1 to 2 years of like high, good academic performance, mostly on the NSPF, which is our star rating system, in order to do that. And that takes about 3 academic years. So whatever enrollment number you pick, you're kind of stuck with, and that's why you really want to be intentional and think through that. Again, I just recommend being as conservative as you can, but also like ensuring that you can meet the demand and build out kind of the enrollment that you want to build out. And then your maximum enrollment down here would be no more than 110% of your planned enrollment. So what do your numbers look like at no more than 110% of your planned enrollment? And hopefully that's a really robust number that allows you to put money into reserves. Dolly, does that kind of answer your question, what I mean by married to that enrollment cap?
It does. It also kind of sparked other questions. So for, so I understand that the minimum enrollment is your budget break even. But one of the questions I have is in terms of looking at revenue sources, when you're analyzing our budget, are you just looking at tuition revenue sources, or are you, if we're listing other revenue sources on the application, are you also considering those? Because for example, again, you know, we're an existing institution. We just don't have our, we don't have, you know, our own charter as far as the educational component. We partner with another school for the educational component, and we have a nonprofit arm that, you know, we receive grants and, you know, and things from, and so that's part of our revenue as well. So is that something that is okay to put in the budget as part of, you know, that break even scenario, or are you looking strictly at what we would collect in tuition from these students?
So really important, we don't collect tuition as charter schools. We are public schools, and so there is no tuition. So really important there.
I'm sorry.
No, totally fine, but just a really important point. So you get funding based on the per pupil. So the number of students you have enrolled is the amount of funding that you get from the state. And we'll talk more about those specific numbers at the next training. But to answer your question, there's opportunities to input pretty much any funding source that you have. What we do require is if it's something that's like a donation or some kind of grant, we need some sort of like letter or verification of the grant in order for it to be included in the budget. So you do have to have some documentation that shows like that this is how much money you'll get so that we can verify those numbers.
Okay. Understood.
So the next slide, oh, Dr. Porter?
So essentially, the budget is based on the amount that's given from the state, regardless. So the extra money is not included in you all's breaking budget goal. Does that make sense?
So you can include any revenue source. The vast majority of any school's revenue comes from the per pupil funding, which is from the state. But if you have additional funding that comes in from a private donation or additional grants, there's plenty of ways to include them within the budget document. It just also needs to come with supporting documentation that you've received that, or that you will receive it. So it can be, if there's a foundation that's going to give you $100,000 and that's going to be in your budget, then it does need to come with a letter that demonstrates that you have that $100,000. So there's several ways to incorporate revenue beyond what's in like the state payments and then federal grants in later years in particular, but any additional things beyond that do require proof of receiving that money.
So it's not going to affect the money we get per pupil.
No, the per pupil is a set amount provided by the state. For this charter application cycle, we're using this current school year's per pupil amount because it's decided by the legislature on a biennium, and the legislatures will be in session and won't have concluded before we need them to for this. So it's going to be used the fiscal year 25 per pupil amount.
Okay, thank you.
So that's roughly that 94, 97 number?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Katie, this is Melissa. I just want to reiterate that under no circumstances can tuition be charged to charter school kids. That should not be showing up anywhere in your budget. The extra money Katie's talking about is really like philanthropic dollars. Just to reiterate, it cannot be tuition.
Yeah, I apologize. That was a poor use of wording on my part. But again, today, because we're not a charter school, that's what we call it.
Right. Kimberly?
Hello, everyone. So my question is, we have an organization that is willing to fund our professional development for a very specialized pedagogy. So do we write that as a budget line, but they're not directly funding us? They're paying for the training and having our teachers come out to the training, and then they're paying for the teachers' salaries while they're at the training.
So I would just have the organization outline that commitment and include that as part of the professional development. And then what you include in your professional development section of your budget will be professional development that is different and sort of outside the scope of what you just described. So because they're not giving you $10,000 directly to do that, it doesn't flow through the school. But you'll want a letter of commitment that says that they plan to do that, and here's what that training will entail. But I'm assuming you would do professional development other than that in, that incubation year.
Yes.
And so you would just incorporate the cost of that other professional development in your budget.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So, just to really demonstrate some of the enrollment concerns on this slide for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 cycles are the initial approved enrollments, which as a reminder would be these planned enrollments here for schools. And then the schools with an asterisk are the schools that all had to have an amendment to reduce their enrollment because their actual enrollment was less than 90% of what they put in their charter application and what went into their contract. You can see what their audited enrollment is, and that happens in June, and we'll talk a little bit more about that process at the next training. But the really important takeaway is that, number one, this number is really critical, and a lot of our schools didn't come anywhere close to their initial approved enrollment. And while there is some growth between June and October in enrollment, it still wasn't enough for most of our schools to hit their initial approved enrollment. So this is a trend we're seeing, particularly in Las Vegas. We haven't had a school open in Washoe County since 2021. So it's been a
2020.
while, 2020. So it's been a while, for counties honestly outside of Clark County, but it is an enrollment trend that we're noticing. Public schools generally are experiencing declines in enrollment across the country. So it's just really important to find really the balance between what the minimum enrollment is and what your planned enrollment is. And just as conservative as you can be, the better suited you'll be to sort of be in a financially stable place starting year one and especially finishing year one. I just can't emphasize enough. Low enrollment really impacts schools for multiple years. It's really, really hard to get caught up from. And we have schools who are still experiencing financial struggles from the low enrollment in their early, like first year. So just really spend some time in those numbers. Make sure that your whole committee to form understands that enrollment numbers and what those mean for the budget. It's really important, and just as conservative as you can be, I just recommend being so. We just simply aren't seeing schools open with hundreds of kids. And that's just the reality that we're in right now. So some recruitment and enrollment hallmarks of success. We're seeing sufficient evidence of year one enrollment. We want to see that there's evidence of demand, that the demand is appropriate for the students, like the students that are showing the evidence of demand are of appropriate age for the school. The application relies on proactive grassroots efforts. Again, most of our schools have to kind of find an edge to get the families to enroll there. And so a lot of that comes from face-to-face interaction, engagement, families that, see you, want to meet you, want to know you, be part of what you're bringing to the table. Some red flags and concerns: there isn't enough evidence of demand, or one thing we see often is once the school is approved, then we'll start conducting recruitment, and that really is too late. You want a solid base going into the application being submitted. And then the application contemplates growth plans that are unreasonable or not supported by a strong rationale or clear evidence. Incubation year development is the next section. The incubation year we call also year zero. It's basically between when the application is approved and the opening of a school. It's about a year. There's a lot that happens in that year, and we'll need to see the kind of plans and ensuring that like all of those steps are contemplated as part of the incubation year plan, which is included as attachment 17. There is a link to the SBCSA's pre-opening requirements. Those are the ones that are in place for this year. Again, we're about to go into a legislative session, so things can change because of that or because of a million other things. So those pre-opening requirements may shift a bit in the coming years, but it gives you a really solid kind of working ground to start with. And there are things way beyond our pre-opening requirements that should be included in your incubation year plan in terms of enrollments and facilities and all kinds of stuff. You'll also want to show the plans for leadership training and development of the school leader during the incubation year. How are they being trained? Who's providing that training? Who's paying for that training? And then it should be clear who will work full-time and or part-time in getting the school off the ground. So between the approval of the application and the school opening, typically we see at least one full-time employee for that entire year, and sometimes a second full-time or part-time employee, just because there is a lot of work to be done, and it definitely can't be done just, after a daily job. So it's really important that there's a staffing plan there. There's a way to pay that person in year zero. And all of that should sort of be clear in the incubation year development. And then this is another one that also has some asterisk criteria that will be evaluated primarily during the capacity interview. We want to see that the committee to form really demonstrates that they understand the challenges of opening a school. It can sound really exciting, and it is, but it's also really, really hard. And each step is a little bit harder than the last. So we want to see like a long-term commitment and understanding from that committee to form and from the proposed board that they're in it and they're going to hang in it and they're going to keep working through the incubation year. It's not a time to step back and just start attending board meetings once a month. It takes a lot of commitment and effort from the whole team. We want to see that the committee to form can work together to solve problems. No matter what, they'll definitely have to work through low enrollment. And so how they kind of work through that, how they plan for that. We'll want to see that they're well versed in the incubation year plan and are committed to following through with that implementation. Again, one of the things on the pre-opening or on the incubation year plan is who's responsible for it. And it should not be the school leader responsible for every single thing. The board is also responsible for a lot of things. And so it's important to see that on the incubation year plan. And those board members should be able to demonstrate that they plan to stay committed through that. And then again, we just want to see that there's a plan for them to continue to be actively engaged throughout the application process and that they plan to maintain that active engagement. Some hallmarks of successful applicants, clear and reasonable timelines, sufficient details and benchmarks. The more details, the better. You really don't want to have just like wide, broad things listed, but like, when are you going to, like, who's going to develop the restorative justice plan? When is it going to go before the school's board? And then who's going to submit it to the SPCSA? And the restorative justice plan is one of a billion things that have to be approved by the board and submitted to the SPCSA. So like really outlining those things. Who's going to do door-to-door on Mondays? Who's going to do door-to-door on Tuesdays? Who's going to follow up with leads on Wednesdays? Like really making sure you've thought about all of the things that go into that first year zero, and you have a plan for it, and that there's a funding source that's available included in the narrative and budget, and there's evidence of that funding source as well. That can be a challenge because one of the like I know a lot of schools use the CSP grant, and you won't know if you're approved for the CSP grant until you know if you're approved for the charter school, if this application is approved. So that can be a challenge, but it's just really, really critical that there is an ability to pay at least one person because it's way too big of a lift for people to do as a volunteer. Red flags or concerns. Leadership plans are not included or sufficiently developed. There's insufficient capacity, and the startup expenses are not reasonable or assumptions are not used in the incubation year plan. Services. Services is one of the later sections, and what I will say is sometimes the devil's really in the details, and this can seem like, oh, you know, we've got all this other stuff figured out, and you know, services, we'll get to it when we get to it, but this can be really critical, particularly around facilities maintenance is a big one that we see. You know, you want your school to be clean, so who's going to come and clean it? How much does that cost? Are you contemplating that in the budget? Transportation is another big one right now. The SPCSA did do transportation grants for fiscal year 24 and 25. We're hoping that the legislature provides money to charter schools for transportation. But that's a really big thing that can really help improve enrollment. Food service, the school's not required to offer food service, but if you're planning on it, who are you planning to use for that? How are you going to organize it? Health and nursing services, that's a really big one. Who's going to come and provide the health services to the school? How often are they going to be there? Who's paying for it? And then another one that is brought up, you know, but IT is another one. Making sure that somebody is responsible for getting people onto Infinite Campus, kind of helping problem solve Infinite Campus, putting in some of the IT structures. So that's another one to consider and think about as you go through this process. Again, hallmarks of successful applicants, there are plans for these with reasonable cost exceptions. And then there's staff capacity to oversee the services. So who's determining if the service is meeting the needs of the school, and if not, what will happen? And then red flags or concerns would be that services are mentioned in some parts of the narrative, but aren't included in the budget or don't make it to this section, or there's not enough information to understand how these providers will be evaluated. And then facilities is the last required section of all applicants. If the school has a facility that has been identified, there are certain things that need to be answered. And if the facility has not been identified, that's fine. You'll just want to provide kind of the area that you anticipate and what some of the commercial real estate looks like in that area. Again, there'll be attachments 18 and 19 for facilities that have been identified. If you haven't identified a facility, you wouldn't include those. But these are important things to consider as you're looking for facilities, and important things you'll need to include. There's also a question about maintaining the facility, a timeline for ensuring that the facility will have proper permitting to operate as a school. We like to see the facility have a certificate of occupancy 30 days before the start of school. Sometimes the city or county your school is in moves real slow. So it's important that even though it's like 30 days before school starts, which seems, 11 months from when the application is potentially approved, you would not believe how many schools are not able to make that a deadline. So a lot of that can move really slowly. Some municipalities may require a traffic study, but there's a lot of work that has to be done with the city and the county or the county, depending on where your building's located, on the facility. And then the last thing is a list of insurance coverage. And we kind of go into what's required by Nevada law and regulation on insurance coverage, but we'll want to see that there's a plan for all of that it makes sense, that it aligns to what you're trying to accomplish with your school and is reasonable. Again, hallmarks of successful applicants here: thorough and detailed description of the facility requirements for the proposed school, should match key components of the academic program and narrative. The budget assumptions for the facility are reasonable and are substantiated by a draft lease agreement if you have one. If you don't have one, you show us that this is how much we're planning to pay. Here's some commercial real estate in the area that's kind of aligned with that budget. Some red flags or concerns: the proposal lacks a strong, reasonable, time-bound facility plan. If you're just thinking you're going to start looking into it once the school's approved, that's not a great space to be in. And then it may include a year one facility, but perhaps that facility is only available in year one. That would also be a bad plan. You'd want to kind of think about then where the school will go in year two and beyond. We do have some schools that we know are in sort of shorter term leases for a couple years, and that's fine, but sort of then what's your plan after that? Any questions on any of those things that we talked about that haven't already come up? Dolly?
So when you talk about facilities and facility space, are you bound to just one facility, or are you able to list multiple locations in your application?
As possible spaces, or
no, with an intention to operate in two locations?
So we do not typically recommend a school approving two locations to open to start. We typically approve one campus to begin with. And then if the school demonstrates academic success for 2 to 3 years, then we can look at expansion. But that is, we do not typically approve multiple campuses in one application.
Okay, understood. And I just have one other question, and I apologize. It relates to what we were talking about earlier with the the minimum enrollment. But I was not able to be on the first training, the initial one that took place, and I have to go back and go through. I know that that's available online and I have to go through it. Is there a minimum required number?
No.
For filling out the notice of intent?
No. You just want to make sure it's a number that generates enough revenue that would keep the school operational.
Okay, and then as far as the notice of intent forms from the families, is there a standard form you want us to be using, or do we put that together ourselves?
Do you mean the evidence of demand, like is that attachment 9, or is it the sheet that for each family to fill out?
The sheet for each family to fill out, like the letters of intent when we submit our
Yeah, so
our
typically the school creates that because then it has like their name and whatnot on there.
Okay, and are there specific items that need to be included in that letter other than, the school and, the explanation of it's this family's intention to enroll their child here, or, do you
No,
need
we
more
look
specifics?
for kind of like age and grade level because we want to make sure it's the
Mhm.
age appropriate.
Okay,
But that's really, it doesn't have to be like a formal letter. It can be like a sheet that they fill out to demonstrate interest.
okay, understood. Thank you so much.
Hi, Katie. I wanted to ask you about that comment, excuse me, no minimum enrollment. Are there some scary levels of enrollment or, scary enrollment levels that you've seen that are just so difficult to adjust their staffing for or things like that, if that makes sense?
Do you mean in the application or
In actual operation that you, I guess, some really low, scary levels of actual enrollment.
Yeah, so there are definitely schools whose enrollment are so low that it prevents them from being able to be fully operational, and then they have to make budgetary choices. But that's sort of up for the board to decide and work through based on the
Thank
number
you.
of students they want to serve and the grade levels. So there's a lot of factors that can impact what that lowest number is.
Thank you.
All right, and then the last section I'm going to talk about is the addendum. And the addendum is only required for schools that plan to contract with a CMO or EMO or apply as a CMO. So if you plan to operate an independent small school, this section you do not need to worry about. And I'm not going to go too deep into this. I'm going to do pretty high level. Just to kind of talk generally about what we're looking for and what we're seeking on this. There are several sections on the addendum, specifically past performance, scale, strategy, network capacity, school management contracts, and then there's one section for CMOs applying directly for sponsorship. Past performance, we want to see strong evidence of past performance, and that's on all 3 areas that we measure, which is the academic, financial, operational, by the CMO and EMO and all replication efforts. So essentially, we want to see that the schools that you have in operation are academically, financially, and operationally successful, and you have data to show us. We also require financial audits to be submitted, and there should be no findings in the past 3 years. And there should also be no deficiencies. We do get red flags if there are schools that are contracting or affiliated with the CMO or EMO that do not exhibit strong performance. Every state uses sort of a different report card for ratings of schools. But we'll try to kind of compare ours, and we're looking for 4 or 5-star schools or whatever the kind of top 2 tiers are in the state system. Legal issues are identified, but maybe not explained within the written application. And it requires diligence from us, and that raises concern about the forthcoming nature of the application. It is also important to note that if the CMO or EMO is potentially going to be opening schools in other states or an application in another state is approved, we do need to be notified of that throughout this application process. So if that does happen, that is the responsibility of the applicant to notify us. Scale strategy. So scale strategy refers to, is the CMO or EMO ready to support an additional school scale up, so to speak? We'll want to see that past scale up efforts have been successful academically, financially, and organizationally. The application includes evidence to support the proposed expansion. If this is the first scale up effort, then we'll want to see how the staffing at the CMO or EMO is best stationed to support this additional school. Potential red flags or concerns would be insufficient evidence that shows us this, or it's not clearly articulated how the EMO or CMO is ready to expand. Network capacity, again, this is roles and responsibilities of the proposed organization are clearly articulated. The application includes details about how the capacity of the CMO or EMO may increase as a result of the proposed expansion. So are they adding an additional staff member to support the additional school, or how are responsibility shifting to ensure that the school gets support while their other schools maintain support? The organizational charts are logical and match the services agreement, and the services agreement is what services the CMO or EMO is planning to provide to the school. Potential red flags or concern, it's not clear that the CMO or EMO has adjusted their staffing to support the proposed school. School management contract. So again, this would be the draft contract between the board and the EMO or CMO. The fees should be reasonable and commensurate with the services to be provided. Obviously, more services would mean more money, but it shouldn't be a fee that's so high that it, wipes the school clean of all of the money that they have. Again, there should be evidence that the services that the CMO or EMO intends to provide this school, they've successfully provided to other schools. The draft contract or application narrative provides clearly detailed measures by which the board will evaluate the services the school is to receive. Again, ultimately, the board holds the contract with the CMO or EMO, and so it's important that they're able to make goals for that CMO or EMO and to really evaluate that organization. A red flag or concern is there is no draft contract, or it's unclear which services the CMO or EMO is going to be involved in, or the proposed contract includes things that are impermissible in Nevada, like an automatic renewal, which means the contract between the CMO and EMO and the school is automatically renewed, or forms of leverage such as facility ownership. A CMO or EMO can't own the facility that the school is in. CMOs applying directly for sponsorship directly will look for clear rationale why that is, and a logical plan to ensure that the sound governance will occur if the school's approved. Again, this is one we see so rarely, but if that's not clear and it's not clear how the CMO will meet Nevada's statutory requirements for governance, that would be a red flag. Any questions on the addendum? And what I will say is, if you know that you have to fill out the addendum and you do have specific questions, it might be better to contact us directly so we can kind of work with you on sort of your specific question. All right, so I'll go into final reminders and next steps. Letters of intent are due again on or before January 30th. Again, you cannot submit an application in April if you have not completed a letter of intent. But if you do a letter of intent, you're not bound to submit an application. So even 1% chance that you're going to submit an application in April, please fill out the letter of intent form. We will reach out to you after the submission of those and set up meetings with each liaison and potential board members about kind of the application process and what the school has done so far. And then we do have 2 additional trainings that will be held at 5 p.m., same time frame. We'll go over the financial plan on February 6th. We did update the financial plan workbook, so I would recommend taking a look at that on our website. And making, like, if you peek around in that, I think that might be helpful. As part of that training, we're also going to offer kind of like a funding 101, how school funding works in Nevada, to really make sure everybody kind of understands that process. And I think that'll help complete the financial plan workbook. And then on February 24th, our 5th of 5 trainings will be on the clarifying questions and capacity interview. And we'll also kind of talk about the like the evaluation process as a whole. So that's another good training that provides good information, I think, before you really dive into the completion of the rest of the application. That concludes our training for tonight. I hope you all have a great rest of your evening, and we will see you on February 6th.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.